Hi there! What you just watched was a short live performance by Peter for which he has built a full playable big band voicing with Divisimate Micro. I thought it would be interesting to have a look at his project file and see how exactly he pulled that off. So let's take a peek behind the curtain and dissect this project a bit. So here's the actual project file with the recorded MIDI from his performance. He played it all in one take, record enabling all tracks, so it's essentially a single set and forget big band patch for live performance that he's built here. You can see the original MIDI from his keyboard and breath controller recorded here, here, here and here on these tracks. When we look at the instrument tracks, we see that they are structured in the way a full score of a traditional big band would be structured. We have 5 saxophones on top with 2 altos, 2 tenors and a baritone. Then we have 4 trumpets and then 4 trombones, in this case 3 tenor and 1 bass trombone. Finally, there are tracks for piano, double bass and drums, but he's only using the bass here. He's using the latest SWAM instruments by Audio Modeling with an instance of ear reverb on each track to position them on the same stage. This is very similar to the way our SWAM big band template for Divisimate is set up, but slightly adapted to Divisimate Micro. Where with full Divisimate there would be the standalone version running in the background and addressing each track in one instance, here each section has its own plugin track for Divisimate Micro. So we have one instance for the saxophones, one for trumpets and one for the trombones. The Divisimate Micro tracks are receiving from all MIDI inputs. And if you've seen the walkthrough for Divisimate Micro, you've heard me mention to never do that, because you are bound to create a feedback loop. But here it worked fine and breath controller and keyboard got recorded without creating a feedback loop. That's because Cubase and Nuendo offer a very useful option in the studio setup. When you head over to the MIDI port setup, you see all the MIDI devices that Cubase is aware of, and in that list you see this little In All MIDI Inputs checkbox. When you uncheck that box for all the Divisimate ports, they are no longer included in all MIDI inputs, so only what is selected here gets recorded on these tracks. This way you can feed multiple controllers into Divisimate Micro without ever worrying about a feedback loop. That's pretty handy. Now back to the big band. With trumpets and trombones, it's pretty straightforward to understand how the ports are routed. There are 4 ports for each Divisimate Micro and there are 4 trumpets and 4 trombones. But with the saxophones, it's different. There are 5 instruments in that section. So how did he do that? When we look into the input section of the tracks, we see that the first 4 are receiving exactly as you'd expect from Divisimate port 1 to port 4. But the baritone sax is actually receiving from port 1 again. So alto sax and baritone sax are receiving the exact same note. He then added a MIDI modifier in the MIDI insert section and transposed the baritone saxophone 12 steps down. So the baritone sax is playing the same note as the alto, but an octave below. This is actually a really common arranging technique in big band writing, doubling the lead line an octave below. Now let's look at all 3 instances of Divisimate Micro and see how the voicings are set up. In the saxophones, we have a pretty straightforward 4x4 routing, so a 4-note chord just gets distributed evenly across the 4 ports. And we already talked about how the top note of that is then doubled an octave below by the baritone. On top of that, they are all transposed to play an octave lower than performed on the keyboard. Here's how they sound in isolation. The trumpets are interestingly only using 3 voices, doubling the top voice to give it some additional volume to really cut through. That means that while even though he is playing 4-note chords most of the time on the keyboard, only 3 of those notes are played by the trumpet section. He also selected the top-down mode for the engine to reduce notes artifacts and also make sure that on the unison lines the sound doesn't get overpowered by the trumpets. Running multiple Divisi engines like this with different settings is something that is completely unique to the Divisimate Micro workflow. The trumpets are not transposed, so they sound as played, and that's an octave above the saxophones. There are trigger plugins on all the trumpets to send a specific CC to set them to the Harmon mute, which has a really characteristic sound. If we set them to no mute, we'd get the normal trumpet sound that sounds a bit more familiar and has more power to it. But that's not the color Peter was going for here, so let's set these back to the Harmon mute. Finally, the trombones are set up exactly like the saxophones. The routing is 4x4, sounding an octave lower than played on the keyboard. So we have trumpets on top with only the highest 3 incoming notes, and then we have saxophones and trombones an octave below playing the full 4 notes, and then we have the baritone saxophone yet another octave below that. That's how we arrive at the full horn section sound. Another interesting thing is the fact that he chose different humanization values for each section, so the trombones are playing much looser while the saxophones are much tighter in the timing, and the trumpets are somewhere in between. This gives the ensemble some additional life, and it's actually something that you currently can't do in the full standalone Divisimate, where humanization values always apply to the whole ensemble equally. Okay, the final thing. How did he play the bass line below? Well, the bass just got all the MIDI through the all MIDI input, and basically he played all the chords pretty up high, so they were outside of the playable range of the bass instrument, and then played the bass line within the range of the bass. And to make sure that the bass line doesn't interfere with the Divisi engine, he activated the low range in each instance, pulled the range limit to the place where he wanted to play the bass, and simply routed it nowhere. This way it is essentially blocked from Divisimate Micro and it's only processing the chords above the range. And that's it. This is how this project is set up. If you want to have a look yourself or use it as a starting point, you can download the original project file from the link in the video description. We hope you enjoyed this video. Let us know in the comments if you want to see more of this kind of project breakdown video. For now, thank you for watching and see you on the next one.